Well, hello and welcome everyone to Inside Exposure. I'm Dave Bennett. I'm the Global MD of Fashion and Lifestyle here at Exposure in London. And today we are in the next segment of Inside Exposure. It's a series of conversations with our extended family and friends from around the world. And really the idea is to share and exchange a few concepts that we hope will be relevant and of value to you. And clearly right now, there's never been a more important time to put things out there to provoke positive debate. So today I'm very happy and excited to introduce two very special guests. The first is my friend Julian Lindley. Julian is one of the UK publishing industry's most influential names. Among his many achievements, he was part of the team that made Heat magazine a real revolution and cultural moment in magazines and celebrity culture. Was also editor of Digital Spy, and today works with the industry to help modernize, evolve, find new ways for publishing to harness the power of today's new channels and ways of communication. Joining Julian today is Chloe Combi, who's best known as the editor of the award-winning book Generation Z, Their Voices, Their Lives, an enlightening account of being young in modern Britain that's received widespread critical acclaim and is currently being turned into a Netflix series. Chloe regularly speaks on TV and radio on a wide range of issues, including youth culture, sex, social media, pop culture of the 21st century, brand relationships, beauty, and self-esteem. And we are thrilled to have both of you here today. Today's topic is Coronials, or Generation Alpha. It's the tech-savvy young children of millennials whose rising influence could soon make Gen Z an afterthought. And we're going to be exploring why purpose and not products is so high on their agenda. So, with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Julian and to Chloe. And just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to be taking questions after the discussion. So please do ask away in the chat channel, and we'll take those questions after we're done with our main discussion. Jules, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for kind of turning up today to listen to Chloe and I chat. I mean, this is in a way a very easy thing for us to talk about because Chloe and I spent hours already talking about all of this stuff anyway. In fact, this session was inspired out of a conversation that Chloe and I were having about the next generation that we're about to encounter. Chloe, first of all, just so we're all kind of starting from the same place, could you tell us a little bit about Generation Alpha or Generation A or Coronials? Like, who are they? How old are they actually? And what's their experience of the world? So give us an idea of who they are and where in the world they are right now.
So Generation A, I mean, there's not an exact science to this, but I think that Generation A fall into the ages 2 to 12 category. And then you've got Generation Z who are in the 12 to 24 category. So obviously, you know, they're still children and they're largely the sort of children of millennials and possibly Generation X. So they're kind of a generation who have grown up with kind of liberal tech savvy parents. And if you like, I think if you slightly take this before the pandemic, I think it's because I think there's kind of a before and after. I think Generation A were almost being looked at as kind of in a very sort of post-Generation Z way, because I think in some ways Generation Z were kind of like millennials somewhat, the guinea pigs of lots of experience. They're the kind of the guinea pigs and the products of kind of social media and sort of being native of the internet. So in some senses, Generation A were almost seen as a generation that almost they'd learn from the mistakes of the previous two generations. So there was lots of discussions around kind of limiting screen time, and I'd had long discussions about this idea of sort of screen units, but you know was somewhat all for naught because obviously they're this completely kind of generation that are already kind of driven by TikTok. I mean, since Instagram and YouTube are yesterday's news. That's kind of Gen Z's thing, so it's very much this sort of TikTok and maybe Quibi thing, so this sort of, you know, very sort of short form generation, sort of very sort of tech driven. But I think there was also this kind of sensibility of not having this maybe more of a kind of a wholeness of Generation A, because I think there's a sort of sense that Gen Z has somewhat become a victim of this kind of tech addiction and having their kind of whole identities being defined by these things. And then, so there was this whole thing about, you know, this massive sensibility about Generation A having hobbies and reading and having these more traditional experiences, and this whole idea about reviving things like, I don't know, scouts or guides and making them much more kind of social creatures, because I always said that Generation Z were kind of socializers, because all their social lives revolved around tech and staying at home. But then, of course, the pandemic hit, which has completely changed course for Generation A, and all this sort of, these good intentions to, make Generation A a product to the land and get them sort of, very sort of social again, has kind of slightly gone out the window, because obviously we've all become incredibly isolated, and hence this term coronials has sort of come to pass, which is probably slightly tasteless. And I think that's now going to be very sort of influential. So, I mean, there's, they're very much in some ways for the taking, because they're very young, but in some ways they're very kind of fixed already, and they have very, very sort of fixed opinions about the world and politics and ethics, and they're very influential within the home and the decisions of the home and the brands and so on. So that's kind of Generation A in a nutshell. I could go into much, much more detail, but I know you've got other things to ask.
Sure, but quickly, before we kind of get deeper into those discussions, it'd be really helpful, I think, for us all to understand what is the research that goes into the insights that you're going to give us today. Like, how do you know about Generation Alpha?
Well, with Generation Z, it took about 4 years to do the book. I should have had the book to hand, I don't. And that was very much kind of driven by interviews. And it wasn't quite so data driven, because I think when I started, it wasn't quite so sort of data compelled. But I'm working with a series of companies, and I've been working on 2 shows actually, and a new book specifically on one on Generation A and one particularly on girls. So I was working with several kind of organisations that are sort of very data driven. And I actually recently, I mean, I haven't really delved into it, but I've actually been given the sort of the data both here in Europe and in a couple of different countries, specifically America, of about 4.5 million 10 to 24-year-olds. So I've kind of got this massive data dump of all kinds of things, everything from kind of, attitudes on sex and climate and brands. So I'm just beginning to make sense of that. But when I do Generation A, and bearing in mind they're very young, so I'm going to do the couple of other projects first, because I think there's a kind of an ethics about, interviewing kind of 4-year-olds, but there's also kind of a sense, because you can't get particularly in-depth interviews for very young children. So I'm very interested in the slightly older ones. But as they start to get older, I'm really interested in interviewing them. And so when I do the Generation A book in a couple of years' time, it's going to be much more of a balance between this enormous data and what the data shows, but also like Generation Z, because I think that was the real heart of Generation Z, these interviews with members of Generation A very extensively. And the other thing is a huge aim was when I wrote Generation Z, it was UK based, because I was very limited at that point and had a very small advance. But this time I think there's much more for lots of different reasons for Generation A to be much more global, because there's massive variations from country to country. There's a lot of real similarities within generations, because I think we're much more of a global world now, but also I think there's a lot more variations between countries.
And what, from your first look at the data, and I appreciate you've literally just only received it a few days ago, are there any insights that are jumping out for the younger people that you are looking into?
What is striking about Generation A is how unbelievably savvy they are about, quite big and complex things. So, for example, I think obviously that has shifted possibly in the last couple of weeks with these amazing kind of Black Lives Matter protests going on, and obviously there's been huge kind of seismic issues that rock the world. But I think with Generation A, it feels like this very, very burning sort of the motherlode issue for Generation A is absolutely climate. The knowledge that they have about the world around them and the issues and sort of the climate issues, and the fact that the world is on fire, and the challenges and problems about kind of using things like plastics, and the goodies and the baddies of the politicians. I think that is quite incredible how conscious they are, and actually how much that they've sort of striven to influence their parents. And you hear so many parents say that their kids are sort of coming home from school and kind of from their social groups really, really aware of these planetary issues. And obviously there's also anxiety about the fact that it causes anxiety. But I also think, and this is, fits really well into kind of the sort of current issues. So they already have a very, very strong sense of justice. And you could really see that with Generation Z, that it's Generation A had this very, very sort of strong sense of right and wrong, and this very sort of, I think, strong sense of fairness. And I think the other thing, which is slightly looking into the future, that I think will probably emerge, not quite yet, but you're already seeing it with Generation Z, and I think it will be even stronger with Generation A, is this resistance to labels. That I think what we see now much more emerge is this notion of things on a spectrum. Whereas, you know, with millennials or Gen Xers, it was very much that I'm heterosexual, or I'm homosexual, or I'm gay, and I think our labels became much more complicated and allowed for the fact that the kind of human experience and human identity is complex. But there was this very specific need to say that I am these things. And with Generation Z and with Generation A, there's much more a sense of you don't have to be one thing. And you hear much more commonly with this thing with Generation A is that I'm mostly a boy, but I'm somewhat a girl. And there's and a much more kind of sort of an awareness that things aren't fixed and don't have to be fixed. So when I think older people, and I know this is possibly more with conservative circles, have this sort of sense of like, you know, oh, you know, there's this kind of lefty liberal thing and all these kind of, you know, forcing kids into these you know, specific notions of identity or labels. And I actually don't think that's true. I think that they are both with Generation Z and Generation A, there's such a different attitude, and there's so much more of a kind of relaxed attitude to this notion of kind of, and a transformation about identity. And I think you'll see that emerge with Generation A. And it's not just with sexuality and gender, I think it's with a whole series of things. But I think there's this idea that, you know, the self is quite malleable. And you're really seeing that with Generation A. And I think a lot of that's rooted in this sense of justice, this sense that there isn't one right or wrong, there isn't one right identity or wrong identity. And I think ultimately that's a good thing.
And what would you say are the things that are influencing them? So obviously, kids, very young kids, are very influenced by their parents and the immediate environment of their home. I mean, until earlier this year, they would have been influenced by school as well, but not so much in the last few months, and unlikely to be for another few months. So what are the influences? Where are they getting these ideas about who they are in the world from?
Well, obviously, there are massively influential influencers. So like you have these sort of TikTok stars like, you know, Charli D'Amelio or Baby Ariel, I've had to think. And I, you know, and obviously you've got this kind of Shane Dawson and, you know, Sprouse twins. So you have that kind of, I guess, what would be more rooted in that kind of traditional celebrities that young people have always been much more influenced by. And I think this is something we're going to see much more emerge. And I said this a couple of years ago, but I think the sort of trend of kind of that me kind of decadent, sort of capitalistic, you know, Kardashian Jenner thing that's all about kind of selling products and selling the self is kind of really on the slide. And I think with Generation Z and Generation A, it's much more about, you know, you've got the kind of the Greta Thunbergs and stuff like that who are much more fixed on the world around them and making the world a better place. And I think that those influences are going to become really important and very transformative for Generation A. And I think what we're looking at, and I think it's a really positive thing, and again, it's the sort of sense of justice in this kind of very uncertain nature of the world, is I think that Generation A, I mean, you began to see it with the younger Generation Z, are really fixed about kind of changing the world and making the world a better place. And the things that influences them will be people who can kind of lead that thing. And in that sort of same way that you saw that very much, and I always say that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And and you sort of see patterns. And when I first sort of looking at Generation Z and analysing them, I thought actually they had quite a lot in common with 1950s teenagers. That was that kind of, there was a conservatism, there was the attachment to the home, there was kind of very low instances of kind of drinking and smoking and sort of sexual promiscuity. And very sort of, and then what you started to see, and which you're seeing now, is this kind of emergence almost of their 60s phase. You began to see almost like this kind of revolution and this kind of antipathy to government and this anger at systems. And I think that trend is very much going to continue with Generation A, because what you're seeing, I mean, I'm bearing in mind that Generation A, the oldest of them, were born in 2008. So that's two major events. They were born under the shadow of a massive global economic crash, which will most affect young people. And then, of course, this pandemic. So you've got these enormous economic social shadows looming over Generation A. And the conditions, and that, you know, that isn't going to affect a small number of them. That's going to affect the vast majority of them. The only ones who come out on stage are the very sort of very wealthy minority. So what happens when you have kind of sociological and economic unrest is you tend to have revolution, and you tend to have unrest, and you tend to have you know, push for change. And that change largely comes from young people, which we're already seeing. And I think there is no way that we're suddenly going to have an economic or social miracle in the next 2 or 5 years. I think that actually there's going to be more social and economic unrest. So what I think you're going to see with Generation A is a generation that's going to be trending very heavily towards change and unrest and revolution, underscored by this kind of real burning sense of kind of justice and this kind of sense of kind of self-influx. The other thing I think that's very influential on Generation A, and will become more so, and I'm not saying this to play to the audience at all, but I genuinely mean it, is brands. And the reason I say that is I think the notion and the role of brands is completely transformed in the last 10 years. And here's why. That I think previously brands were always something that people bought into, and you wore, or you sort of bought into the kind of lifestyle, whatever it was. But I think now what young people, and I think this will become even more kind of prominent with Generation A, is young people look to brands as moral compasses, and they look towards them as guides, and they look towards them for their values. And the reason is fairly obvious, is because there is a sort of declining in trust in things like government and systems and societies to work in their favour, whereas brands they often see as these kind of things that actually are for them. So increasingly, I think young people do look towards brands for their set of values. And what you're seeing with brands is very much becoming guides in issues, you know, whether it's racial justice or LGBT issues or feminism, and brands are having to make decisions. There isn't really a centre now. They have to, you know, we're sort of seeing that, for example, with Nike, with the Colin Kaepernick issue. And obviously, them siding with him, they knew they were going to lose probably older, more conservative audience, but they were going to gain a younger, more liberal, more diverse audience. And I think what you're seeing now is brands having to be both moral guides and take a sort of an ethical stance on issues. And I think that's really good, because I think it means that you know, they have to kind of stand for things, they have to stand for values, but it also means that you're kind of put up on a pedestal, and if you wobble or shake or you fall off, then there's that, you immediately get kind of thrown into this cancel culture, which is huge with young people, and I think it's going to become more so. And you put like in the social media stocks, and it can, you know, be quite damaging. So I think it's a fairly high wire act, but I think that whole sort of attachment to brands as part of their value system is going to be really important to young people. And, you know, to be perfectly honest, if you say to lots of young people, say your average 11-year-old, which would be the older Generation A, what are the values of the Republican or the Democrat Party, they might not necessarily, some would, because they are quite politically savvy, but they might struggle to say, you know, what those parties really represent, except maybe in the broadest terms. Where if you said to them, can you tell me like the difference in values between, say, Microsoft and Apple, or Nike and Reebok, or Fenty and Kylie Jenner, they'll be able to tell you those. And again, so it's all fixed into this kind of brand and value system. So it's pressure on, you know, brands or influencers, because we're always in this enormous pressure on them to sort of almost be kind of perfect. But that's the reality of dealing with Generation A and Generation Z.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but just going back to what you talked about most recently, like how important, can any brand pretty much find a way to pivot their comms or what they are doing to engage Generation A? Or is actually the whole point that it has to be an authentic conversation? Like, how important is it that the story of the brand matches up with the values of the
That's such a good question, because that authenticity is like, it's such a mysterious thing, but authenticity is so important. And it's so cringy when you see brands trying to pivot, as you say, to certain value systems, like these ridiculous, I'm not going to name and shame anyone, but these people making these ridiculous, like, we support Black Lives Matter statements this week, when their values are anything but in favor of, racial justice or whatever. So that authenticity has to kind of be deep, and that story has to have a kind of a backstory, and you can't suddenly just say, well, I'm really pro LGBT plus because it's favorable to the particular audience. So you have to really walk it like you talk it. But all that being said, I think that nobody's perfect, and you can have those kind of road to Damascus moments. And I think that what always amazes me is when brands do screw up. I genuinely believe the only response is, we're incredibly sorry and we're learning. I think that that's sort of crisis management number one. But no, I think that, authenticity, I think, isn't something that you gain overnight. I think authenticity is something that you kind of, it's quite a long and complex process, and there are so many brands that have this very long traditions. And I think that the notion of nothing is, any sort of brand that's 50 or 100 years old is obviously going to be quite different and change. And I think the whole authenticity is also that very much embedded into that is evolution, that we were this and now we're this. But one of the things I think that if I was, and I do often advise brands, particularly brands that maybe are struggling with these new generations and the new worlds, is the most important thing is that you have to, as a brand, look like the audience you're trying to appeal to. So it's very stark with, let's say, when you go into brands and they have a very narrow sort of, the people they employ, so it's very sort of a very narrow representation of people. And I think the key thing is, and I think there's lots of, you can really see this with brands that evolve the fastest, is that if you want to appeal to a diverse audience, you have to look diverse yourself. Because I think embedded into that comes an understanding of who you're trying to appeal to. You can't really understand the experience of someone who's totally different to you. And so that's why I always say to brands that diversity isn't something you do performatively. It makes an awful lot of sense, and it helps you sort of modernize, and it lends to that authenticity that you can sort of develop and grow. But I think, sort of to answer your question, I think that authenticity in that story absolutely does have to be real, but that doesn't mean to say that evolution isn't possible. And I think anyone who sort of said, well, you're fixed in these are your values, this is who you are as a brand, and you're fixed in that, that's completely wrong. And I think Generation A and Generation Z are actually quite generous, and if they feel like a brand is changing or growing with them, they will accept that.
Is there like a, please share any examples if you can think of any, but are there any segments of brands that kids are more interested in others? So, for example, is fashion going to be as critical for this generation as it has been previously? Are they more interested in tech brand? Like what segment?
I think like we are. I mean, anything to do with beauty, I think is and remains absolutely huge. Sort of beauty and sort of technology are absolutely massive. I think the key thing with sort of any brand is that kind of that massively sort of diverse appeal. Like, I think that one of the things it's a huge, like, we're moving away from is this, for example, this idea of kind of boys fashion and girls fashion. That feels very, very kind of like 10 or 20 years ago. But I think that, there is this, huge kind of sort of diversity. But one of the things that I think, for example, has changed, so you've got technology, you've got beauty, you've got fashion, you've got all those things. And I think one of the things that will develop is, I think that with Generation Z, I think it was a really fair experience that they valued experiences over possessions, because, and there was a whole kind of slew of complex reasons. We're not going to talk about Generation Z, but I think that one of the real areas of growth for Generation A is going to be the development, brands that are developing the self, because we are kind of like, so for example, one of the last 2 weeks has been this real, like, everybody's had to do their own hair. And for the first time, everybody's had to kind of do their own makeup. So there's been this whole sort of sense of like, how self-reliant are you? And I think that that's kind of been a real shock to older people. But I think this kind of notion of sort of like development of self and self-reliance is going to be really big for Generation A, because I think one of the things that we're starting to see, there's sort of the end of lots of systems. And one of the things that I've been saying for a couple of years is we're seeing the end of sort of the school system as we know it. And I think the kind of the pandemic has really accelerated that. And what you're seeing with, so I think you'll see with Generation A is this much kind of sort of sense of sort of self-reliance. So this sort of development, so you're going to see sort of programs and sort of things that are all about how you develop and improve yourself. And you're seeing those really expand massively with Generation A. And that wasn't particularly with Generation Z. That was much more, it was about the kind of, you know, the collective and the grouping. I think Generation A, one of the real areas of growth is going to be about sort of self-expanding and self-growth.
And so what would your advice be for brands to prepare for this new generation and to prepare successfully, so that, you know, like, what lessons should we be learning in order to make sure that we communicate authentically and properly with these guys?
I think one of the things that they really respond to is this idea of individuality. And one of the things that you still sort of see is this kind of like with brands is that this kind of one size fits all. It's like, you know, this one set of trainers, or this kind of one pair of shorts, or this one style of lipstick. And we still haven't really embraced that much, this idea of kind of individualization. And I think that that's why, for example, things like social media, and specifically the new ones like TikTok, are so beloved, because it's this completely unique and personalized experience to you. And you can make this your you know, your completely individual self experience. And I think that would be much more grown, this whole idea of this, you know, that we had that a bit like a while back with this notion of virtual reality, but I think that's going to be much more kind of the future, for almost kind of, you know, a bit like kind of Sims, but for the self. And I think you're seeing, you know, with there's been a little bit this notion of personalization of brands, and you get that a lot with kind of celebrity brands, and those are really popular. I think with Generation A, that's going to be this real idea that you are not a sort of a number, that you are you, in this notion that everybody's slightly different and everybody's things suit everybody slightly different, and this kind of embracing of that. And we haven't seen that much of that. And again, that's the really beloved thing on things like, you know, sort of TikTok, is this idea that you can change your world and change your identity really to how you suit you. And I think that's something that Generation A will be looking at brands to.
Do. So I can't believe I've literally got less than halfway through my question. I'm already halfway through. So look, I'm gonna, before I hand back to Dave to like take some questions from the floor, I guess where I'd like to sort of end, although there's so much more to say, is like, if you could put us in the time machine, take us forward 20 years, Generation A, adults, how different do you think the world is going to be? How will this interest in purpose have manifested itself?
I'm going to say because there's not much time, there's two major things. I think the first one is this massive shift from west to east, that we are, you know, as in the Western world, are massively used to this kind of dominance and proliferation of the West and Western culture. And with Generation A, you've seen this massive sort of shift away, you know, whether it's, you know, K-pop or fashion or, you know, TikTok, to this much more, you know, these influences, much more kind of Eastern influence. And obviously they're massively, I think that the dominance of those countries and the influence of those countries are going to grow in every possible way. So I think that kind of almost there'll be kind of a tilt on the axis for Generation A, which will completely transform, I think, you know, everything from kind of politics, society, to economics, to fashion, to make up to how we look. And I think we're already seeing the beginning of that, which is a really interesting thing. And I think that I was actually talking to someone at Yale University just before the pandemic, and we were sort of talking about the things, because in a sense we are kind of the architects of slightly our undoing, and this will impact most on Generation A, because we are AIing ourselves out of existence. Everything we are, by making AI more and more sophisticated, we're basically eliminating ourselves as our use. And we were kind of talking about, and we started to talk to sort of kids about, and also older people, about things that you wouldn't be happy for a robot to do. And the only things that we could sort of settle on that wouldn't be replaced by AI, and this is really impactful on Generation A, are so far haircuts, like you wouldn't want a robot cutting your hair, brain surgery, architecture, and the arts. So you wouldn't want to go and see robots doing Macbeth. Everything else was kind of basically, robots can do that robots can teach people, robots can direct traffic, robots can drive cars, and it's quite a frightening idea. So I was talking specifically about this, and because they were saying, well, what should we advise our youngest children to do to have a kind of secure future? So it's kind of like brain surgery, hairdressing, architecture, or acting. So it's probably not a particularly sort of satisfying answer, because it's actually slightly depressing. But I think that you know, it's going to be hugely different. And I think it really depends on us. And I think, and for us, and it's the question is how human we want to be. And I think it's a huge existential ethical question, but I think that is really what I'd say at the moment. There's a big maybe, and I think so. This shift from west to east, and this question mark over like how useful we're going to be in 20 years, and the question is that it's not looking great at the moment. So keeping human for
and I would say being human,
and humanity is, you know, remains important, and I think it's really important.
But it's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing to hold on to when you're trying to think about what the future looks like for your brand, because obviously you still are going to have to try and make a connection. You know, that's going to be a question that consumers are going to have. How human?
I think that's true, and I think one of the things that people do remember is a human touch, and the thing is, you can never artifice, well, not at the moment, but you can't artifice things like falling in love or caring for someone or having a great conversation or like, you know, the kind of those sort of very human experiences, unless they get replicated. So I think with brands, and I think this is true, because one of the things I think that people become obsessed about in the future is that they forget the kind of universal, and the universal remains. Young people still worry about how they look. Young people still want to fall in love. Young people still get anxious about exams. Young people still fall out with their parents. And I think telling the story and the stories of young people, and kind of and answering those questions, and that reminder that kind of the humanity is a kind of a universal and eternal, I think is really useful, because I think we are becoming mechanized, and I think that brands who stay in touch with humanity actually are still doing really well with young people.
Okay, Chloe, I literally could carry on talking for several hours, but we've hit 30 minutes. So Dave, shall I hand back to you to kind of field some questions?
Yeah, thank you both.
We have to carry on though.
Discussion. Anyone with questions, we have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so please do ask. While we're just sort of waiting for that, I do have one actually that I was thinking about, which was, Chloe, you mentioned something pretty terrifying and scary, which is the fact this generation's been bookended by these massive moments of social upheaval and financial, kind of challenges. And that's clearly going to present a problem and a set of challenges for this generation. How much and how far do you think brands have to go to step in to solve those challenges? You know, we talked a lot of our brands about how meaningful they can be in the role they play with their younger audiences. And is it about kind of providing training or opportunities to get a leg up in careers? How far do brands need to go in the future to help out the Generation A?
I think it's fairly limitless. So I'll answer that with two things. I think, yeah, number one, in terms of becoming future employers and providing opportunities and providing fair opportunities and becoming like great sort of, employers, I think that is of limitless use, because aside from, with mental health, climate, the biggest concern of young people is obviously jobs and employment and sort of the future. So I think becoming employers of the young is incredibly important, and obviously answers masses of those anxieties. But I mean, number one, more than anything about sort of fashion or desirability or who you have fronting the brand, that I think with young people is, can I afford it? And I think one of the things that is going to be a huge trend, which is I'm sure it's a bit of a mixed blessing to brands, I think is going to be the trend of sharing. That we like, with Airbnb, and now we're sort of beginning to see this idea of sort of sharing cars and sharing bikes and sharing scooters. And one of the things that certainly sort of the older Gen A's and the younger Gen Z stuff is, what about the sort of the future of sort of sharing clothes or sharing makeup, or more affordable kind of lines, because this is not going to be a wealthy generation. So I think that brands need to start getting really creative about how they, because I think there is the spectrum of wealth is widening. You have the enormous wealth, serious poverty, and this kind of very, very wide berth. But I think people's expendable cash is becoming less and less. And I think brands that are creating creative solutions that are allowing for people who don't have lots of money, which is increasingly large amounts of young people, are not only doing really well with young people, but I think they're seen very positively. It's like you are catering for all of us, and not just sort of, your wealthiest clients. And again, I think it feeds into that whole value system. I think lots of that's required of brands. It's like, we're not just about capitalism and selling, we're also about kind of values and inclusiveness as well, which again, I think I know that's a lot to ask of brands, but I think that's the reality of the future.
That's great, thank you. We have a question from Sarah, which is, what do you think brands have to be most careful of nowadays?
I mean, people are deeply sensitive, and I think that we are very attuned to kind of language and aggressions and insensitivities, and I think people can sometimes, be put in, people are sort of very, very reactive. But I think the biggest thing is being sensitive to big issues. I mean, I don't think it's a big secret that, for example, Pepsi didn't handle the Black Lives Matter issue the best. And I think that, they would admit that themselves. So I think it's sensitivity. And I think if the biggest thing is, if you're not sure, ask the people that it directly affects, because they will be able to tell you sort of directly, what is the best language, what is the best kind of way to speak about this experience. And, I wouldn't speak about the kind of sensitive experiences of outside my kind of bubble of experience. So I don't think any brands should. And I think, again, it goes back to that thing of diversity. If you have a very diverse workforce, you're never going to run into those problems of not knowing what the experience of a Black woman is, or a 16-year-old sort of, trans kid or something like that. And I think that's really important.
Right. Absolutely. We've got one more question from Sean, which is, how do you think it's possible to reach Gen A on TikTok in an ethical way?
In an ethical way, I guess I think it's this idea of using sort of TikTok in a kind of, to sort of promote ethics, ideas, learning. So it obviously sort of TikTok has become this kind of, useful platform for promoting sort of products, and is a sort of a really useful kind of advertising and selling device. But I think it's also a way to sort of sell values and learning experiences. So I guess it's sort of work. I mean, I think one of the biggest issues for Generation A, and I think it's going to be one of the biggest, is misinformation and disinformation and fake news. And I think it's going to be a scourge for Generation A, this idea of false prophets and bad information and kind of being sucked into kind of misinformation bubbles and being radicalized by kind of ideas. And the only way that you fight that is with experts and good ideas and good information. And I think it's going to fall on good brands to really promote thinkers and sort of people with ethical good ideas to kind of really push and promote these ideas, because I think it's, you know, some of the most powerful people in the world are kind of idiot conspiracy theorists right now. So I think, again, it's this idea of brands pushing ethical good people to counter all the crap and the kind of toxic stuff that's out there.
Right. We've got one last question from Priyash. Does music matter anymore to this generation? You mentioned beauty and technology. What about music?
I think it does. I mean, it's that kind of it's not that kind of long player album, you know, play from beginning to end. I think that is in that more kind of like millennial, Gen X and baby boomer thing. And obviously they experience music in completely different ways. Like, for example, there's lots of music is heard through things like computer games. One of the biggest promoters of sort of music now is actually heard sort of via computer games. And obviously there's the kind of YouTube experience. But yeah, I do think it matters. And you do have these massive kind of flare up songs. And I think there are hugely influential artists. So, I mean, so for example, I think a really great sort of Gen Z, Gen A music icon at the moment is Billie Eilish, who is incredibly kind of creative and has got that kind of, you know, and is doing something genuinely unique, and lots of people sort of comparing her sort of like, you know, Bjork of her generation. So, you know, so yeah, I think it just can't be judged on the past. It's not comparable to maybe people who like collected and alphabetized CDs. It's consumed totally different, but music is really important to them.
That's great. Julie and Chloe, thank you so much for today. Really appreciate it. This was Inside Exposure. Thanks everyone for joining and watching. We'll have the recording up on our social media channels. And until next time, have a great rest of the week.